My guest today is Jeanne Wakatsuki Houston. She's an author, and she's written a new book called The Legend of Firehorse Woman, and we're going to talk to her about that. So Jeanne, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Fred. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for being here. I know you're not feeling too well, so hopefully you'll be able to get through this in one piece. But talk about, the first thing I'd like to do is just have you talk about, how did you get into writing?
Oh, how did I get into writing?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I majored in journalism at San Jose State. This is way back in the 50s. And I had hoped to be a journalist. And, but after 2 years, my advisor told me, you know, you'll never get a job. You're a woman and you're Asian. That's a double negative. You'll never get a job. So I changed my major to social welfare. So I just kind of let that dream go. And my husband is the writer.
James Houston.
James Houston,
yes,
right.
He's very well known,
and
right.
So, and it wasn't until 1971 and that I re-entered the writing world, and that was with Farewell to Manzanar. Of course, that's the whole story about how I got into writing that book with Jim. And I don't know if you want to get into it right now or not. But
yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, Farewell to Manzanar is your first novel.
That's
Actually,
right.
it's a memoir of
That's
sorts.
right.
Okay.
It's nonfiction.
Nonfiction.
And Legend of Firehorse Woman is fiction. Excuse me. But actually, that has a very emotional beginning. And what happened was that my nephew, who had been born in Manzanar, had been born in camp, was a student at UC Berkeley. And he came over one day to Santa Cruz, and he asked me, you know, Auntie, I don't know much about Manzanar. I was born there, you know. And I've just heard about it for the first time outside of the family in a class at UC Berkeley. What can you tell me about it? Now, you know, I'm the youngest of 10 kids. His mother is my oldest sister, and she'd given birth to him in camp. And so I began to tell him what the family always talked about when we got together, which was very lighthearted, very superficial about camp, if we ever talked about it, which is rare indeed. And so I did the same spiel, telling him. And now Gary was a child, or he grew up in the 60s. He had a very different, you know, idea of himself and of you know, about civil rights. And he just was listening to me, and he looked at me and he said, Auntie, he says, this is bizarre. He says, you talk about being in prison like it was nothing. He said, how did you feel about being in prison like that? No one had ever asked me how I felt. I had never allowed myself to feel, and for that one moment, I did. And I became hysterical. I started to cry. I could not stop crying. I didn't know what had happened to me. And so, knowing that I couldn't speak with him, I said, look, let me write a family memoir. At that point, I had 37 nieces and nephews, and 7 had been born in camp.
Oh,
and I
really?
knew they didn't know anything about their birthplace.
Yeah.
It was just like a secret in the family. So I said, let me write it just for the family. But something had happened. Actually, today I know what had happened. It was post-traumatic stress syndrome. See, the time had come when, you know, those defenses wear down. This is what happened to Vietnam vets. And so when suddenly he asked me that question, and that feeling part opened, I reverted back to the original emotional stress, which was grief and sadness, etc. Well, I tried to write the memoir, and so then I approached my husband, who was teaching writing at UC Santa Cruz, and I said, you know, I'm having trouble with this project. And he said, what project? And I said, well, I want to write this memoir, and I began to tell him. And he was absolutely stunned, because we had known each other 5 years, married 15 years, and I had never told him.
I see.
This was the secret in my life, you know, that sometimes I had thought even was a dream, because I was so young when it happened.
How old were you?
I was 7.
You were 7 years
I was
old.
7 years old, 7 to 11. I was in Manzanar.
And Manzanar is located in Southern California?
No, it's located up in the eastern desert close to, not too far from Bishop.
Okay.
In Lone Pine.
Lone Pine.
In Death Valley.
Death Valley. Oh,
up there, so
hot.
it's very high desert,
Right.
very extreme weathers. And and he was just stunned. And I said, I can't seem to write this because I was in tears all the time. I thought I was
Right.
having a nervous breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
He says, this isn't a story just for your family.
Right.
He said, this is something that every American should know about. He
Right.
says, let me help you write it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my re-entry into writing. That was the beginning again. And so we both together wrote, it took a year,
Right.
but there were months and months of taping my memories, because then we found out I have a photographic memory, too, that a lot of it dealt with the breakup of the family, my father, and then we also had to interview other internees and do a lot of research, and we were stunned to find out that there were already 40 books written on the subject, but they were all written by Caucasians, never from the point of view of someone who experienced it as an internee, and they were all stuck in the libraries.
Right, exactly.
So our task, we felt, was to educate, make the story accessible to a wide range of age groups.
Right.
And that's how Farewell to Manzanar
I
came
see.
about.
So you were kind of responsible for actually bringing this more to the public conscience, because, as you say, there's other books were kind of in the libraries, no one was hearing about that, and it slowly, I think, has had an effect on it. You're hearing more about it. You hear more about this situation.
Right. Well, it wasn't our purpose, like, per
Right.
se, to say, oh, we're going to educate the world, but we knew that the resolution of of this type of thing that can happen to a group of people has to come through education.
Yeah.
First of all, people have to know about it, that it can happen.
Right.
But we didn't want it to be a scholarly book, and so at the time it was, and we had a hard time getting it published.
Did you really?
Oh yeah. So it wasn't like, we're going to just change the world. In fact,
Right.
we're so very surprised that it's kept alive until today, and that in fact
Right.
more people are reading it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, apparently, isn't it kind of required reading in some of the high schools here in California?
Yes, in California, and it was a required, not required, but it was a choice of the state of Missouri.
Oh.
It was a state reading project,
Really?
and for different towns, Lodi picked it up. So the town of Lodi.
And they made it required reading
Yes.
for their school. That's incredible. So 1970. So that was in 1972 that the book came out.
73.
73.
Yeah.
Has a movie been made of this?
Oh, yes.
There was a movie
yes,
made of Farewell?
A movie was made in 1975, and it was a world premiere, what was it, world premiere history, on NBC.
Okay.
Yeah, prime time. John Cordy was the
Okay.
producer-director,
Right.
and yet won some awards. It was nominated for Emmys,
Really?
and we won some awards with it.
That's incredible. I've read it. It's a small book.
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, it kind of reminds me of Steinbeck, some of the books that Steinbeck has written, and you go into the characters and you really bring it to life. And this latest book that you've written, The Legend of Firehorse Woman, which actually I've learned a few things myself about the Firehorse Woman.
Yes.
Because my wife is Japanese.
Oh, is she really?
Yes,
I didn't
yes,
know that.
Yes, and it turns out that she's a Firehorse Woman.
Oh, she is. Well, I just found, I found out after I wrote this book, that my twins, I have twins, a boy and a girl, they are Firehorse, and also the wife of my son.
Yeah.
And she's half Chinese and half German.
Right.
But she's a Firehorse, so my God, I mean, I was doing this subconsciously, I didn't know.
Well, yeah, I learned something about that, and I think it's incredible because it's every 60 years.
That's right.
That when someone's born, there's a birth year every 60 years that they're under this sign. And in Japan, it's kind of considered, well, not very lucky.
That's right.
Right.
Because the women are too powerful.
Too powerful.
You see.